front, but I'm not resisting the urge now. Hey, backbencher. Yeah, I think that the point of this is not, we're not up here to discuss. We're here to talk together. There are plenty of seats at the front. You too, Claire. Okay, I'm not going to talk into a mic. Can you hear me back? So I would okay, so as I mentioned this morning, I thought rather than have each of us give mini presentations, that I really think would like this to be a discussion for us to kind of wrap things up. We really did put this conference together with a set of questions, and there were two, I think, groups of questions, but really they're all, each of those groups were variations of a single question. I mean, of two single questions. So one was, and so I'd just like to restate those sort of two big questions, and then maybe say a little something, and then just throw this over. So one was that the question of what, yes, I want to ask the questions, then I'm going to give it to Myra. Sorry. And then the one question was, what does feminism have to say to the Anthropocene? That is the concept of the Anthropocene need a feminist critique? And I think there's been a lot of discussion of that today, including over the weekend, and including questions about the name of the Anthropocene, beginning with that, but also questions raised about human agency, masculine, patriarchal agency, things to that end. So one question roughly was, what does feminism have to say to proponents of the Anthropocene, advocates of this as a concept? And the other one was the reverse, which is if we are in an age, in an Anthropocenic age, when human effect on the planet and impact on the planet can be measured in the same way that non-human impacts on the planet can be measured, then what does that say to feminism? And what does that say, in particular, to questions of, we've seen feminism already answering those questions through a new materialism, for example, and related discourses. So really, those are the two of the questions I'd be interested in us pursuing. But Myra has to catch a taxi or a plane, and I've asked her to say a little something before she left. So.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna throw something out there, and then I'm gonna run away. So, but thank you, everyone. Everyone I've been lucky enough to talk to at this conference, it really has been great. So here's my little thing. So, one of the questions I've had throughout this conference has this been a conference about Anthropocene feminism or Anthropocene humanism? And I always think back to this very profound time in my life, this game changer for me, when I spent this year with in the geosciences department at UMass and worked with Lynn Margulis. And she, as I mentioned, I think her, she and her colleagues were really found humans to be, it was a place where we weren't allowed to talk about animals, humans being an animal. And we weren't allowed to talk about animals at all. So any time I would make any reference, they would just say, animals are totally irrelevant to everything. It's the microbes. So, and Lynn used to always say, she passed away a while ago, and it rings in my ears. That she used to say all the time that the one thing that she thought made humans human was our ability to self-deceive. And it's always really stuck with me. And so I'm wondering, perhaps, whether what differentiates the Anthropocene feminism from Anthropocene humanism might be around the question of violence and responsibility, which I think has come up several times in the conference. It's something that I think about all the time. And it for me, in my so-called career, what this has meant for me is the moment that I started to talk about the non-human in my research, I was told I was not being a very good feminist. And the moment that I started, the moment I started, and I'd get questions like, well, how does this help women? And then the moment that I started talking about, the non-human and the inorganic as being central, I was told I was not being a very good humanist. And the questions changed from how does this help women to how does this help humans? How does this help people? And I've never had a very good answer to that because that's not what I'm centrally concerned with in my research. And I wonder whether it's because it plays on this, our self-deception around violence, the necessary, inescapable violence of living, of dying, of being here and leaving here, and our ethic of responsibility around that. This is what preys on my mind in the wee hours of the night. No, actually, it's my kids done their homework, but no. Anyway, that's my provocation. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, safe travel.
Thank you. And now
I have a coat.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. All right.
Bye, Myra.
So I would just say just briefly, and then before the company to the panel or to all of us, is that I guess that question for me about feminism versus humanism is actually a question that feminism asks itself. I mean, is Anthropocene feminism about humans, or is Anthropocene feminism a way to bring the insights of feminism to non-humans and the study of non-humans and the well-being of non-humans, the concern of the care of non-humans and so forth? Then maybe it's obviously not a choice, right? But I mean, these are two ways to think about it. And I do think that at moments, one of those ways has taken the floor in some talks, and another talk the other way has taken the floor. And so that's about all I want to do to get started. Audience?
So I would just throw out, and this is an old feminist argument, which is that feminism doesn't just mean taking women as objects or study, it's also an approach to lots of forms of study. So I guess I'd kind of like to throw that out, if that's, because, we've heard that there's the feminism that actually doesn't have anything to do with the Anthropocene, but then there's the work and the approach to it that's so clearly feminist. And I guess I'd love to hear you all sort of think about your specific relationship to that practice, method, approach, versus the objects that are taken up.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna say something that's, I have to say that I teach I was the director of gender studies at Columbia. And half my position is in gender studies at Columbia. And I'm more than happy to be a feminist and to be the product of feminist struggles. But not just feminist struggles. And feminism is not, and feminist, like political feminism of various sorts, are not the only places in which the question of for whom is asked. And nor is it the only domain in which the problem of the human becomes a problematic. So without being against a feminist approach, I need to say that my understanding of the Anthropocene, the way in which I tackle it, it doesn't primarily derive from feminism, nor does it primarily probably derive from queer theory, although, again, I am a typical product of queer struggles and feminist struggles and a lot of other ones. But I do think it's important for me to say that the approach I take, if I have any approach on the Anthropocene, and it's a very strange, for me it's very strange even being on a panel on the Anthropocene. That's not kind of where I would have, I was working on gerontology long before I knew what the Anthropocene was. It was really, I'm one of those people that said when the Humanities Centers invited me to give a talk in Canberra on the Anthropocene humanities, I said, I don't know what it is, and they said, and I looked it up and it said climate change, and I wrote, I said, okay, look, I'm pretty arrogant, I think I can write on anything, but I can't write on climate change, I don't know anything about it. Nevertheless, at this point, I understand something, which is my approach to the Anthropocene is very much tethered to the question of settler colonialism and the very problematic sign that we call Indigenous critical theory now. And that's important because the questions that I ask are questions about not life and death, the obsessions with extinguishment, the drama of the human, but the way in which that division, not the division between life and death, but the division between life and non-life plays such a central role in the settler governance of certain kinds of other worlds. And of course, in a particular way from where I work. So for me, I'm happy to say Anthropocene feminism, but it's not actually what drives why and how I approach it. And I think it would be wrong, at least for me, to say, although I think feminists also ask who, that's the only who, and I think depending on how we cut into this, very different kinds of questions get asked, very different kinds of divisions get put under pressure, and very different kind of organizations of governance are revealed.
I think I addressed this pretty clearly in my talk, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but because I really did confront it quite directly there. But for me, I think that feminist theory and feminist activists, feminist politics, do offer ways of thinking the self as this material entity that's also shot through with political systems and positioning and everything else that is a kind of counter to the extraordinarily abstract formulations of the Anthropocene that result in some ways, because of this stretch of deep time that we're trying to conceive of, and the challenge of that kind of extraordinarily diachronic kind of sense of things. But I think there's real dangers in that, clearly. And one thing that does keep getting reinvoked, I think, is that the challenge of thinking across deep time has wiped out a kind of plane of multi-species interactions, right? And so most of these formulations are all about the human and the human through time. And it doesn't, in the effort to do that, it seems like we are wiping out all of these sorts of planes of multiple species and multiple chemistries and all of these things interacting. And we're getting this sort of plane or sort of linear formation like this in this effort to think what the Anthropocene means. That's
not paying attention to all of these trajectories that are sort of more horizontal or synchronic in terms of multi-species assemblages. So that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with feminist theory. That's more of a sort of multi-species or post-humanist or inhumanist or something perspective. But I do think that there are ways in which, when something new comes about, there's a rush to put everything back together in safe ways, and I think that feminist theory offers ways of critiquing those modes of being and knowing and the sorts of formulations by which people attempt to sort of protect themselves from this new threat, either psychologically or the ways in which different modes of consumerism have to kind of shore themselves up again and reproduce themselves once again, so that nothing is ever sort of changing, despite, say, some kind of cataclysmic concept of the Anthropocene or species extinction or human extinction or anything else. You throw anything out there. You know, Stuart Hall said this about ideology, right? The dog catchers go out every night and round up the strays. So anything that you throw out there that you try to change things with, the forces are so mighty that come back and like pull it all back to where it's supposed to be, put everybody back in their place, make sure that the capitalist systems run as they're supposed to run and everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so I think those forces are there. And so I think that all sorts of modes of feminist thought and queer thought and critical race thought, post-colonial thought, all of these things have to also go out every night, again and again and again. You're sort of never quite done with these struggles because everything keeps getting put back into place. And so these traditions have to keep at it too, even if we get tired of them. You know, even if you sort of get say, well, I've already sort of in my own life or in my own mind, in my own work, I've sort of figured that all out. And then things reemerge and you see the same things happening, like all sorts of feminist thought being expelled from various completely new fields that are purified of any contamination of gender or feminist theory, right? And so this sort of continual happening of it makes feminist thought relevant again.
I'm scared it's going to come down.
I've been on and on too.
We can go.
We can add it back. Does anybody else want to talk about feminist methodology?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can put it
Besides
back
us,
there.
I mean, the answer.
Jeremy.
I was just going to say, I mean, in recent work that I've been doing and also thinking with Claire and also Myra about this kind of new critical life studies thing that we're thinking about, all these studies, like feminist studies, like we keep having to make a list over and over again about, you know, and who are we non-including, you know, oh, we forgot about critical race studies, or we forgot about class, we forgot about this. You know, over and over again, we keep having to make this list, and I've been arguing that it's a kind of, I don't know, let's say, identity politics within the university in a way. It's a new LGBTQI blah, 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 of the university, and to clear that kind of, I mean, thinking about, I guess from my perspective, and again, it's just one humble opinion, I mean, I'm thinking about the ways in which all of these studies and terms that, you know, all these exciting, the ontological term, the affective term, now the Anthropocene term, whatever, geological term, we start to list all these things, all these new exciting, you know, cyborgs, whatever, post-human, and eventually, I mean, I think they all really have the same logic. I mean, what we're ultimately thinking about in each of these different sub-disciplines or studies or terms is life, and this, as Elizabeth said, you know, life, non-life, not necessarily life, death, but just the question of life and how we uncritically deploy that in so many different domains, such that we keep, as you know, Stacey just said, we keep having to reconsolidate around, you know, these studies and terms in order to fight or be resistant against the forces that are mightily putting us back in our place. Because again, I think in the end, all of us have the same goal, you know, it's to justify or to think critically about our own lives or about life itself. And so I think, we keep reconsolidating around that, and I think the sort of study of life in this way, not life, death, or whatever, but the Anthropocene perhaps offers us an aperture into that possibility of looking at life differently, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, I argued in my own paper that I think it's very counterproductive to feminist and queer methods and strategies and goals to use Anthropocene or adopt it as something that would be ours.
Why? I didn't see your paper, why?
One more time.
The 5 papers.
I mean, the two in addition is just that I think that it has to do with the question of time, and it has to do with queer versus non-queer, or queer and feminist temporalities of futurities, and the ways in which the Anthropocene sort of truncates the virtual possibility or the virtual potentiality of queer and of women to come into being, I guess in a nutshell. Because the Anthropocene shuts that down, right? And the Anthropocene sort of theorizes the possibility, well, it theorizes human existence and the future of non-existence, whereas some feminists and some queer temporalities theorize non-existence and the future of existence for queers and for women. So it's a kind of inverse temporality, such that the Anthropocene shuts down the possibility of queers and women ever being able to come into existence.
So, sorry, I just want to, and I'm a minority voice here, I think, but I do want to say that my worry is that we say, oh, these are all the same logics of life, that what we're shutting down actually is non-life and the future of non-life. And so back to the methodology. So I don't want, at least I hope what this conference would do, and partly reflected in some of the invitees, but not all of the invitees, because actually in all of them, because they represent different positions. So what I hope we would do as well, and not shut down, is to make a space for not just critical life studies, but critical non-life studies. So the geo-ontological.
The idea of studying life critically is to include it as if not life itself in an organic, carbon-based way. The whole idea is to expand and make life this unbounded and open.
Why can't we take non-life and make it expanded and open and swallow up life by it? No, see, that's what interests me. That's more monstrous. That kind of because again, the tremor is, oh, that would, what could we do with that? So that's what I want to say. Let's try the other way. See what happens. Yeah, no, I know, but again, this is not a. God bless. We never attack each other. No, God bless. We never attack each other.
Both Jamie and
But
Claire
exactly.
Rejection is the new acceptance.
But yeah, that what would, and it's not just the inverted, the old kind of supplement deconstructed way, but perhaps sense life and sense, and again, not to say Aristotle, uninterrupted seeing to now. Of course, there's been all kinds of shifts. Has exceptionalized it through this imaginary potentiality. That's what life is. It's potentiality. He could have been a player. All I could think about was how I hear Agamben's negative potentiality. It's like, even as we explode everything, we could have done it. We could have been a player. And still exceptionalizing it that way. What happens when we pit everything that life's exceptionalism is and say, no, it's just non-life? And well, that won't hold.
Don't you
So
think that's
something
equally
else would happen.
polarizing?
Absolutely. I want to run it over in order for some, perhaps us to say, well, that doesn't work, so can
It's like
we?
saying patriarchy really sucks, men shouldn't rule, let's have.
Non-life is not patriarchy, God, non-life is the
Right, so instead of,
Yeah, that's-
instead of, men ruling, let's just have women ruling, or let's just have queers ruling, instead of.
I just don't think it's the
It's just
equivalent.
another kind of.
No, I
Well,
know.
but if you go back to where, if you go back to say, let's say you go humanism, feminism, which is where this, our now absent friend. What happens is you get someone says, well, rights of man. And someone says, wait a minute, right? So you get feminism, but then that becomes this new, hey, wait a minute, when you say women, what do you really mean? So, okay, well now say the other. When you say the other, and it's not that, it's
And when you say rights, what do you really?
yeah, but I mean, what I'm talking about is the strategy of and when you look at it, this is the problem with the Anthropocene. It starts as this really cool concept. Oh, look, we're going to shatter all our anthropocentric projections. Okay, suddenly it's not about us anymore. So that's phase one. Then it becomes completely about us, and that's why it's which is why it has to be a continual process of defacement and disfigurement. Because you say, look at post-humanism is ultra-human. There's nothing intrinsically bad about the word post-human. It could have, and you start with
It could have been a player.
could have been a player. But what happens is it's like every if you look at it stratigraphically, every concept has a highly humanizing form. Like nothing is that biopic about Darwin, it's like life's grandeur, right? So Darwin is this great writer of like progress, proliferation, diversity. So everything, everything gets reappropriated back into the humans. This cannibalizing concept, which is why I think you're right, feminism isn't the only thing that does it, but it stands as this sort of, hey, wait a minute, right? And it's like a minus sign, it's like this positive refusal of something that would be the human. And I think that's, so when you say like, what's going to happen when someone puts an Anthropocene feminism, it's not going to be the Anthropocene. It's going to be like, wait a minute, right? And I had actually, it makes you, what would it be? Right? So for me it was like, I didn't have here's the, you do, and when you do with your students, I do, what would a feminist analysis of this be? And you do give them a textbook, you look at it. Whereas this is, it's more, wait a minute, and stop having this cannibalize everything else, which is what other inscriptions and you're right, feminism isn't the only thing.
Yeah, that's all I want to say. I mean, and it was the question. So
Yeah.
Part of me is interested in, since there's not going to be and none of us would think there's a singular answer to this, then what's the stakes of, say, if it had been, an indigenous,
Yeah.
the anthropocentric indigeneity or something? Well,
Sort
it
of
would
what's
have
coming
created a
in
different
2
kind
years.
of well, but it would have also been, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Right, but it might have opened up other kind of way, which is fine. We would also want that, not have the feminist one.
But it's interesting
also
that
to
is exactly what happened. You have a feminist Anthropocene conference, and like, I don't know, 20% of the papers just are happy to talk about indigeneity.
Well, critical race, we have a little
Yeah.
bit of it.
That's the game.
Anybody else want to get in so we don't hog this? Yeah.
I just have another question that connects to this. But how do you, okay, so if you're going through these conflict processes of defacement of particular kinds of concepts, and I feel like there's actually something necessary and useful in thinking that. How do you remember long traditions of, say, feminist thought? Where there's something, for example, about new terms like the Anthropocene that comes in and suddenly sort of mobilizes certain conversations that are already going on, have been going on for a long time. But it actually, those conversations have very different motivations, very different stakes, and they have long traditions of within themselves. How do we not develop a kind of amnesia of those conversations where it feels like we're reinventing the wheel all the time, and yet we're able to remain critical in terms of, say, defacement and figuring out how concepts aren't working for us?
yeah, I think that was one of our aims in doing this, was to acknowledge that there is a.
Yeah, and that's
feminist-
Stacey's point though,
Yeah.
that, you know, because, I mean, it's as though that when the Anthropocene comes, oh my goodness, you know, humans might be destructive. I was like, that idea was never there, you know, or maybe, you know, maybe some humans are like particularly appropriative, like, so you're absolutely right, that's it. And I think, you know, for those of us like that are even more literary, you can see that once deep time is discovered and you go back and you read people, even like, you know, Virginia Woolf, but beyond that, you suddenly realise there's been this sense of deep time that, like, contemporary poetry creates a tradition, like eco-poetics. It may begin now, but then once you read it now, suddenly retroactively reinscribes all the other strata. So I think that's probably one of the other, there are these other, that's another thing that feminism is, it's another genealogy.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, I've been in women's studies for a long time. I've been in women's studies for a long time, and so I experience women's studies as this really paradoxical space. And for me, it kind of represents how I feel about feminism or Anthropocene or any of these terms that we want to apply to this strange thing that we do. I don't even know what to call this strange thing that we do. I think of it as like trying to always think otherwise or something like that. But we need institutional support for our projects, and so we form
that's right.
programs and have conferences, and we name them.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of reification that happens that is actually at odds with our intellectual projects. I mean, that's just what happens over and over again. You know, what I tell my students all the time is I don't believe in women, but I'm in a women's studies department, and I actually like that weird position. Like, I just like, I'm always uneasy, always. And I feel like there's a strand of feminism that carries that through really well. And, you know, you can call it anti-foundationalism, you can call it whatever you want. But there's another strand of feminism that's not that at all, right? It's the opposite of that. It's really about, you know, continuing the standpoint of cosmologies and certain forms of institutionalization. And, you know, it's what Janet Halley calls governance feminism or something like that. And so I think it's really important to recognize what I see as this tension between some of the institutional and foundational impulses of feminism and the other ones that are more deconstructive, anti-foundationalist, whatever you want to call it, that I think tend institutionally to get pushed in the background. I don't think when people think about what feminism is, they don't necessarily think of it the way you were talking about it earlier. I don't think that's how a lot of people think about feminism.
Isn't the danger worse, though, that they don't think about it in terms of politics, not in terms of institutions? I mean, in some ways, you know, there's institutions and we work within them and we do what we can. But I think what you're saying has a larger impact if we think of how feminism is taken up politically to only be a kind of identity politics. And the anti-foundationalism part is not even thinkable, right, in terms of a broader, at least for U.S. politics, which is not so, you know, intellectually operating at a high level.
Yeah, I was going to entirely for say, what would we call this institution in which I sit if we named it now? And the closest I came to was like a critical corporeality with the wide open thing about but what, you know, and then I actually tried to very carefully say, what would the little key politics of that be? What kind of leveraging could you have in the organization of the political now? And do we see why we still proliferate, say, you know, ethnic studies with this kind of brown people, and then gender studies, which is mainly white people, and then, you know. But then the question would be, like, Anthropocene feminism, would it really be Anthropocene corporeality if we were, but I'm serious, like, what is this thing that maybe we might all be, but can't,
my young self and Anthropocene.
It's in
And there was
Anthropocene.
discussion about
Yeah.
Greco and Latin pronunciation.
That's what I
Okay,
heard.
now I always said Thoreau, but
No,
now I've
no,
been
it's
told
in
it's
Anthropocene.
Thoreau,
Yeah.
whatever.
Well,
I'm
whatever.
Southern, I say Anthropocene.
Yeah. Take it from an Australian. It's Anthropocene. Because we know the Queen's English.
Aluminium, after all.
I just, the only thing I would say about this is, I kind of love, I mean, I cursed this many times, which was just kind of like really thinking. But then I never thought that they were trying to put I never thought they were trying to put the two together. And then, I mean, I always thought it was almost like function like a metaphor in which you put two things that are not together, and you try to see what comes out of it. And I actually think the conference did a kind of good job with the papers that I heard of doing that. And then my only hesitation would be like, when you do that sort of work, is there a tendency to do an overly good job? Like, I feel like there were moments where we got overly creative. And ended up kind of slightly like with like really nutty things. I guess the thing that I feel like I maybe had a lot of thoughts about the Anthropocene or whatever it's called, or pronounced it, and then not so many, I'm more confused by ever than what feminism is, or like it was less nailed down in some way, or felt like the less, I don't quite know how to put it, because, I mean, the Anthropocene is so recent, and we've got like a fairly, even though we have a lot of debates about when it starts or what it is, it seems like it's a fairly, it's not as wide a category as feminism, which is just like wide open, and we can pretty much say anything about what it is at this point, in which there's a kind of almost like a dilution around it, so it's hard to put it back. And I think like that was my anxiety about the overly creativeness. Like, at what point does academic discourse need to pull itself back down and try to begin to like, Never.
We have a question over there.
Rebecca has her hand up. I think she.
Thanks. I guess I'm kind of perplexed by this conversation. I think in part because I think this is a very old point, so I'm perplexed by my taking it as perplexed. But it seems to me that part of the framing of feminism and Anthropocene together is called into being by the way that the conceptualization of nature that we've inherited is scripted along the analytics of gender and sexuality. Yeah? So that the sort of biopolitical management of natural resources is already conveyed through a metaphor of gender and sexuality, such that we need to be attentive. I mean, it's not like we're doing that. That's the dog catchers.
Yeah.
Those are the conditions under which we're laboring. Is a world in which the question of the Anthropocene gets, at least in part, framed as a kind of resurgent vitality of the earth, which then needs to be managed, and I think through things like rolling back reproductive rights, right?
Yeah.
The threat of a kind of emergent or insurgent earthliness because of kind of desire to manage women's bodies. And so I think that we come to these conversations as feminists because these conversations are coming to us as people who are run through with those power dynamics. And so I guess so maybe this isn't a question at all, it's just an intervention. But one of the things that I wonder about is whether you see those, as we turn from a kind of biopolitics of sexuality to a kind of geontology or a biopolitics of non-human vitality. I guess there is a kind of question about whether those frameworks, queer theoretical and feminist frameworks, are still the kind of right ones for. So maybe that's what.
That's my question. Okay, that's my question, and all I'm saying is I agree with what you said in the beginning. I'm just saying, if I'm honest, and I stand in here and be somewhat honest, that the way in which the question about whether these frameworks are any more the productive ones comes from, yes, a certain training in queer feminist stuff, but also I really have to say it comes from a very specific place in which the problematic presented probably that I think through weren't sexuality and gender. So and I think it's really important for me to say that, lest, not because, not the old critique of feminists as first world or whatever, but rather that we don't allow feminism to be in all of its particularities.
So Delia, you.
So I agree with the first, and, yeah, I'm not going to say.
Thank you, Rebecca. I've been told to speak loud, so.
You want to use a mic?
Please.
Come on.
We're always making you use a mic.
Make everybody do everything Cato did.
I don't know why I'm not loud enough, but I just want to say thanks, Rebecca, for clarifying something. But I think it's interesting. It was very helpful, Elizabeth, that you said the question that comes from feminism is who or for who. And then Claire, this morning you reminded us that we should also be asking to whom is this trace that would leave intelligible. And it seems to me that the one thing that came up in our planning of this conference and persists in this conference is that the Anthropocene, apart from feminism, builds that question of who into the naming of the geological era, that this is the, whatever it is, it's certainly the first era that's self-reflexive. And that's why it seems appropriate that we get caught up in these proliferation of answers of to whom, for whom, by whom, with consequences for who counts as a who, or what counts as a who. And it seems quite appropriate that feminism would be one way of opening up that, opening up that question and answering to it, but that we shouldn't be surprised if a lot of other critters line up to the geological era after us. But it seems that actually the inauguration of the Anthropocene, and it's being taken up in circles quite outside of ones that have been concerned with the questions of who, is actually becomes an invitation to feminism and other critical methodologies to actually elaborate what it means to name a geological era with reference to a who.
Yeah, Arun, and then in the back.
Thanks. It's been a great conference, so thanks again for setting this up. It's also a bit of an old question and a bit boring, but how do we, as mostly humanities and social science folks, get to interrogate science, but also, the amazing thing about the Anthropocene is that basically these scientists, which are on the whole not very political, come up with this, basically the best framework ever to change the situation drastically. And how do we capitalize on that? To what extent can we convince scientists not just about feminism, but also anti-capitalism and just sort of changing the whole globe, in a very drastic way? This is not a science studies question, but it is a question of the philosophy of science, and it is a question of standpoints and secluded knowledges, but it's also a question of autonomy and sort of dialogues or coalitions and ways of persuading.
I don't know that it's our job necessarily to do that. There are a lot of scientists who are activists as well, and they go to that because they see what the hell is happening, and then they become activists. And there are a lot of scientists already crossing those lines. The research I did, say, in environmental health and environmental justice issues, there were a lot of people writing about how they grew up on scientific neutrality and objectivity, but they just couldn't occupy that position anymore because they saw what was happening. And so, I don't know that it's the role of humanities people necessarily to try to change scientific practice in a particular way, although I think all sorts of collaborations and interventions in various ways could be really productive, but maybe not from that particular position, I guess.
Add to that, just to say that I wonder if in your question you're sort of suggesting, and if you are, I think you're right in suggesting it, that the question is, how can you get scientists who have come up with this concept to listen to scholars from derided disciplines, to allow them to have input, and right?
Yes,
Okay, so you're expressing a frustration that I think is, speaking as a scientist,
is well-founded, because I know full well how much scientists don't know, and how undervalued the contributions of people from humanities and social sciences are, and how much science would benefit from listening to that input. So, you know, I think you have to keep trying, you know, I think you have to, and I think you need to pick the people that you speak to, because I think that there are increasing, I mean, I think Stacey is right, that there are increasing numbers of allies. I mean, talking just about climate justice, which doesn't happen to be my particular focus, but, you know, a figure such as Hansen, you know, who was saying, you know, I just have to, you know, I have to put myself out there as an activist, you know, because I can't believe what scientists are stonewalling on. So, you know, and I think that feminism is such a hugely powerful tool, and it's absolutely necessary for, you know, feminists to contribute to this whole questioning of the Anthropocene, because I don't think that the Anthropocene, I don't think so much that we're responding, I mean, I can see why it's valuable to think about feminism responding to the Anthropocene, addressing the question of who, but I think that actually we're addressing, the Anthropocene is addressing not simply who, I think more deeply it's addressing a phenomenon, like a real phenomenon. And, but of course that phenomenon is processed through, you know, through the social. So that's why it's critical that you don't give up.
Okay, all the way in the back.
Thanks. I just want to reiterate how incredible it's been. So thanks to everyone in the audience and the panelists. And I want to paraphrase Stuart Hall because I think he offers a really provocative, one of the best sentences ever written. And I think that the "it" in the sentence could be feminist scholarship, but I think that it could and should be also considered critical race theory, indigenous studies, decolonial thought. Maybe some of you know what's coming. As a thief in the night, it broke in. It offers, I don't say it offers 5 points of intervention, right? As a thief in the night, it broke in, interrupted, made an unseemly noise, seized the time, and crapped on the table of the Anthropocene.
I love that, Stuart. I posted that on my Facebook page. I died, actually, that same quote.
Awesome.
Love that quote.
Can I go back to the conversation between humanities, social sciences, natural sciences? You know, yes, we all need to have conversation, and we have to, once in a we just sidebar saying, we don't even, I mean, I grew up in a science family, so I kind of like science. Like, I grew up with pocket protectors. You guys know what pocket protectors? So, you know, and a real worshiping of science, like, you know, it's just like, wow. And this, talk about a boring thing to say. I'm going to say something we all know, but the one also has to be, of course, wary of the line that says, wow, there's these severed epistemologies, right? And we need to bring them back together. We need to become literate with each other again if we're going to solve the problem of the anthropocene. The only hope is that we sit with scientists, sit with humanities, sit with performers, sit with the social sciences, so that we can knit back together this conversation that's grown apart. What we also have to do at the same time is say, what is conserved? What has been conserved as we've supposedly grown apart? And that I don't hear so much. I do hear strands across these severed conversations that one wants to really push on. For instance, when you know, the whole evolution of minerals. I want to say, geologists, push that one. Don't immediately say, well, life came in and it interacted with the minerals that created the opportunities for minerals, because it's just like, it's just, how, you know what I mean? So it's like, how do we also listen to what we're all presupposing, though in very different vocabularies and forms? It's not exactly the same presupposition because it's in different formation, but nevertheless, we can't just say, oh, we're just gonna retether them. And that's a little bit what worries me. So it's, and again, this is just an old stalwart, we know we need to do it, but I don't see us doing it enough. So.
Other questions, interventions?
What about us trying to be politically strategic? I mean, we don't have to, fully retether these ties that are broken, but there are ways to make connections that aren't about that, going, completely shifting your position, but nevertheless being in conversation. It should be really an either or, but it's a complicated dance.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to say that's, yeah, as we're doing the dance, how do we also say, wait, what do I hear?
Right, it's going to be awkward. And,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen.
Oh, yeah, I like it.
I'm afraid this is going to make me seem like a total nut, but like what do you, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody here who, comes from the perspective of, religious traditions, and faith-based traditions, because, I mean, I think what needs to be conserved is the particularity, like feminism brings a concern to the particular that I think we've been critiquing when we complain about rightly about the topic, the moniker and prophecy. But, I think that theologians who are concerned about justice are invested in this conversation as well. But I don't know that anyone here.
Oh, do we have any?
Theologian?
I'm not a theologian, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. In my synagogue, we're planning a whole year based on the what's called the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year, and the Jubilee ideas of how can we give a Sabbath to the earth, and how can we correct the disproportions in society that have grown up as a consequence. And they're all there, the discussions of death, the discussions of the commons, the discussions of redistribution, as well as giving the earth. And so we're going to, it starts in the fall with the Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and we're planning how we're going to do this throughout the whole year, address it. And I know Jewish people all over, or at least liberals, are discussing how to address the sabbatical year in these terms and on the verge of the Anthropocene. So.
Can I change the topic?
Sure.
Okay. This is one thing that I've been thinking about, and I wish Jeremica was here, but because it's actually sort of a critique of her work a little bit. So I really wish that you were here to talk about this. But
Somebody's to tweet this.
yeah, yeah, thanks. Luckily, I'm not on Twitter, so so fundamental to the notion of the Anthropocene and Anthropocene is that humans have been this major geological force with this vast amount of power to change everything. And when you add in the chemical, the biological changes, everything else, huge change of everything. Okay, so you have that, but then how do you not then exasperate the sense that the world is for, I'm trying to, what's to and for the human? And what was disturbing to me, and we talked about this, what was disturbing to me about some of the things that she had created was that, and they were very clever, but you see the lights, and then the fish go by, and then the fish text message you something, but hey, how are you doing? Are you having a fun night or something? And I mean, and then you get the sense of the human walking through the world and encountering non-human beings, and yet they're talking to you, texting you on your cell phone in a way that's completely and utterly couldn't be more human. In a way that it's almost, she pushes it so far that it becomes parodic. And that's good, because it could be parodic or ironic. But on the other hand, it does give the sense that you're moving through this world and everything is for you. Everything is for you, for your entertainment, for your edification. So I guess, and that's sort of the opposite side of the Anthropocene. So So you have the whole sense of culpability that we pretty much fucked up everything, everywhere. But then the flip side of that, with this sort of technological play, is that then it's all for our amusement. It's so lovely. I don't know if someone wants to. Yeah, this is right up your alley, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I would defend, I mean, just because I really find the work interesting.
Yeah.
I think what I appreciate about Natalie's work the most is that she often pushes steps ahead of what is intelligible. So the irony of, actually having the birds or the fish speak to us or speak to us in some familiar language, I think calls attention to what precisely what's problematic about the idea of thinking from the perspective of the non-human, of the rocks, et cetera, because our access to them is mediated by our instruments. And as soon as we're thinking about the perspective of the critter, or looking through the fish's eye, or we're already imbricated in that technology and that system. So I actually really appreciate that she highlights how much we actually try as we might, if we try to escape the way in which it's for us, we have to build a machine to do that, and then we're back in. So
You don't think you need some kind of radical difference or something that you encounter that just doesn't quite?
well, I think this is actually how you encounter it. It disturbs people with this all the time by, putting critters and plants in places that they seem clearly uncomfortable or misrepresented. But to me, it raises the question of how is it that we aspire to have access to them?
Would you like it better if they said fuck off?
Yeah.
And also, when you're saying that, I think about all of nature poetry, which often has the same problem.
Right.
And then I'm thinking also about animals and ads, which drive me crazy, like when, BP uses fish or,
Fish said fuck off.
Or if the salamander tunnel, actually, it was something you had to climb over or something like that.
I mean, and the reason I raise the question isn't so much to critique her work, but it's more that this is the kind of flip side of the notion of the Anthropocene itself, right? That we pretty much are everywhere, have fucked up everything everywhere, and there's this kind of all-encompassing quality about it. There's this notion that even the Anthropocene could be made into something super consumerist, right? Like, what'll happen. I mean, if it hasn't already. So
There was a dying question, a comment on this.
I'm double dipping at this point, and it's just an intervention, so I'll just be quick. Which is, I just wanted to say, Stacey, that I think that the way that you articulated the problem with the Anthropocene, I mean, I agree, I think the Anthropocene is a problematic concept, but I think one of the things that dropped out there, I want to reinvigorate in our conversation, is the idea that our systems of management, biopolitical management, just of producing labor, right, rely on the activity of the non-human. And it's that activity, that amplification in Hannah Arendt's terms, of nature's metabolism, that this contemporary ecological crisis makes non-regulative, right? The problem is that we can't regulate, right, these instabilities. And this is, I think, part of the point that Claire was making. These instabilities mean that the biopolitical mechanisms of management and regulation are failing. To the extent that we're even maintaining them in a neoliberal state, right? And so the really threatening thing is that we're going to find ourselves unable to not just to meet nature, but unable to have a place in these new instabilities that are unregulatable. Right? So
And the other non-human thing that I find drops out in some of our formulations is things like technology and the mechanical, because it's not just that humans have done this, but I mean, humans have done it through collaboration with the delegation of agency to all of these technical non-human systems, where we might design a system to do X, but then what happens is when we design to do X, it also does Y, Z, A, Q, whatever, that creates these consequences that we no longer are in control of. And that's, to me, one of the stunning.
Yeah, and I think you kind of get a glimpse in the mountaintop clearing part of it, where, it's like the big truck and the dynamite, but actually it's, where exactly that goes, how exactly that goes out, the way in which it eliminates labor through this amplification of the huge truck machine.
And the little machine.
And the little machines,
Yeah. Kevin, you had something
to bring back Myra's concept of objection, which I thought kind of spoke to that way in which we think about how nature responds to things. And I noticed in the course of a number of discussions, but like how Claire really pointed out a different way of thinking about this, that we often think of objection as in a kind of conservative, conservationist, retroactive way, like keep things the same. And that to think of the eruptive changeability of materialisms allows us to also think of objections that are emergent. So one of the discussions I've heard with studies of microorganisms is suddenly the world has this huge resource of energy in this indissoluble plastic, which is throughout the oceans and everywhere really in our environment. And at some point a microorganism is going to develop in such a way that it eats plastic. And at that point it is going to explode. That's an objection. It may end up destroying our ability to even use plastics because it's uncontainable in certain ways. So like, I also think of objection as being this provocative and eruptive set of mechanisms that are humanly based in certain ways, but certainly aren't controllable or determinable by us.
Or regulated by the deliberative public.
Yeah, right.
And
They're
thus
not
the,
decisions.
yeah, it's thus, forget about what it goes. It's interpretive, but it's not.
Wasn't the point of Chiapel? Is it?
Yeah.
That human beings in certain ways can think in a reactive way to the non-human. That if we stop thinking just about ourselves, but think of ourselves as this network or as part of an environment, of an ecology, we can react and respond to, and that's what we have to learn once again, is how to react to and respond to all of this that's going on, how to be nimble, how to be flexible, how to be able to live in a world that's volatile and is not under our control anymore. Isn't that sort of the lesson?
Nimble and flexible are really, those are loaded words in
Yeah, I know, that's right.
in neoliberal management.
Yeah,
And so one needs to be really careful about it.
Yeah, if I could translate it back into the conversation that Claire was having, and I thought you were talking about, then I would be fine.
I'm not an academic.
That's okay.
I'm Mr. Public who
Yeah.
came to this and doesn't know what to make of the jargon.
Yeah. Maybe you want to intervene again?
Just quickly, I mean, the thing about the idea of objection is it's wonderful, but I think we have to remember that actually objection often takes the form of opportunism, actually, and you're quite right, it actually says the goals, what they actually say, and what Myra's goals say, feed me. I mean, the birds do say that, and so all the bacteria, the fact that we don't like the things that might object or take an opportunistic advantage of our detritus. I mean, it's a question of collaborative, why we have such distaste for the triggers that might drive on our own destruction.
Yeah, well, that's.
I have a question about the relationship of scale in all of this.
Louder.
Sorry, I have a question about the relationship of scale in all of this. It was brought up in the last panel on hospitality and hostility. And the question basically is around the concerns around the sort of this perceived necessity for having some kind of geopolitical response, right? So like one of the troubling aspects of something like the Anthropocene is that it does, in a certain sense, call for a certain kind of reinvigoration of the United Nations policy, which is obviously what we see around things like the IPCC, but which is a complete disaster and a total failure. And like, but that there is something about the way in which this particular geological or chemical, ecological moment is calling for a certain kind of politics that does respond to in this kind of globality.
But at the same time, like a lot of the things that, you know, we're sort of trained to think about in terms, like as feminists, is a much more kind of like local in a certain sense. I mean, Juliana, when you're talking about the port situation, I think that kind of a politics is like maybe connecting those two things, right? Because it actually does speak to the way in which the geopolitical movement actually happens in formation by way of a localized system. But the kind of objections, like I sometimes, like I'm really in sympathy with the kind of politics that orients itself towards certain types of objection, but at the same time, I'm also concerned that doesn't have the kinds of ramifications or scale. Like this question of scale is a real problem, right? I think that's what I'm trying to kind of muddle through and get at.
Can I just say something really quickly? There's a difference between scaling, right, local, and then you scale up. And often in the Anthropocene, we scale up and become global. And what I think Myra was saying, I think with the ports, and it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about this, and these networks of circulation, right? So that, and you're like the personal is the geological, or the where do my, were you saying which one? Where do my plastic cup go? That's Myra. That's Myra. Yeah. So now is that scaling up, or is that paying attention to what we now call circulation, or And I think there's something really important about which way we go, because when we scale up, we end up with the human, the global, the abstracted, and when we look at circulation, which a lot of us actually do, you don't get there. You start understanding, say, in a port, that what's in that port has a lot to do with the form of the ship. So what do we know about these big container ships? They're transduction machines, right? And I think that has a lot to do then with how we think about time and questions. We often think of time as scaling up rather than time as endurant modes of movement. So, sorry, I
think that's really, can I just...
Because that kind of lateralization, the premise that there isn't some kind of scale that is lateral, that smearing, that miredness, that enmeshment, that interactivity, that binds those sedimented layers that we also want to talk about, those durational times, those chemical times, those microtemporalities, those micron particles with that sort of larger cosmic drift.
That's fine if we start with that way of perceiving it. We often start with like this other imaginary of scale, which just goes scaling up. Yeah. Which is really just abstracting out.
No, I mean that's not actually what I was trying to get at.
I just wanted to say that I just want to know which kind of scaling we're talking about. But don't you?
No, because can I maybe just say a point of clarification, just so that the question was not really around the question of theoretical implications or like methodological interests. The question was actually like a political response, right?
But I want to say that let's take what you're saying is, it's true that there's all these political problems, but suddenly this one comes along, right? And you're right. If we don't deal with this, you can't deal with all the others, if I take it. But, you know, we could put the other big, every concept has its 15 minutes of fame. And, you know, the other one that's doing, that's probably competing with the Anthropocene is the brain. Because that's like, we've had this geological event, but we've now had with fMRI imaging. And I've been to conferences where people have said, I've heard neurologists say, this discovery changes everything, because we could now have forms of cognitive and moral enhancement that could change the human species such that we'd all be benevolent, we'd all stop killing it. So I agree with you that it looks like when we're in the thick of this one, that one scientific fact now puts a like it's a scale, it's like this is too serious to be worried about local political concerns, and what you said, it's a geopolitical issue. But for these, and I didn't believe they existed until I heard the papers. And it was a similar conference. It was someone like, okay, we've got to start getting everyone together to talk about the brain. I was like, you don't realise we've now got the technology of cognitive and moral enhancement where we could make everyone clever, there'd be no more disability, there'd be no more violence, there'd be no more malevolence. Now it's sort of crazier, but it is to say you can't have, okay, the Anthropocene has been witnessed and now we've got a geopolitical event that's got, like, hell, this is important, we've got to deal with this. Because there are other conversations going on, including economists, that are saying, unless you fix you can't talk about climate justice, because unless you fix the huge financial crisis, it's called the global financial crisis, unless you deal with that now, you can't deal with the climate stuff. So it might appear to you that the geopolitical event is the one that's going to take over all conversations, but unfortunately or fortunately, it doesn't appear that way to everyone. So I think it's not as definitive as all that, even if we think it should be.
So we've kind of reached our designated scaled time, and there is a bus waiting to take people somewhere. And I'm down for closing remarks. So all I really want to say in my closing remarks is really a bunch of thanks. So I want again to thank Rebecca Sheldon, Delia Hanna, and Emily Clark for helping to conceptualize for making this thing work. Emily gets multiple thanks. I want to thank Emily Clark, our two wonderful project assistants in the back, Matthew Bowman, Audrey Jaffe, John Bloom, also director in the back, and a host of student volunteers. So how about a big hand? And a really special thanks for Annette Hess, who really runs all the business stuff and really makes sure the university gives us what we want. So a big hand to Annette. Finally, I want to thank the plenary speakers and really all of you, because we had this crazy idea that it might make sense to think about putting the Anthropocene and feminism together. And remarkably, like all of you crazy people too, like responded and sent in proposals, including many crazy people who sent in proposals we couldn't accept for lack of space and so forth. So thanks to all of you for making our madness a reality.